we want to onshore the manufacturing of critical technology. One of the most critical pieces of this is the cellular module. Kind of any connected device will likely have a cellular module in it. None of that manufacturing happens here domestically. And what we are doing is we're bringing back cellular module manufacturing to the U.S.
Welcome to the O.H.I.O Fund Report, a podcast dedicated to elevating Ohio's collective ambition by highlighting the most compelling stories of innovation and growth throughout the state. Each episode carries the industrious DNA of Ohio, exploring the state's technological progress and economic renaissance. Before we dive in, just a quick note. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Nothing you hear today should be taken as investment advice, a recommendation, or an offer to buy or sell any securities. Today's guest is the CEO of one of the O.H.I.O Fund's portfolio companies, meaning we do have a financial interest in the company being discussed. As always, views expressed by our guest are their own and don't necessarily reflect those of the O.H.I.O Fund or its affiliates. Any forward-looking statements you hear today are based on current expectations and may change. Please do your own research and consult with your advisors before making any investment decisions.
Welcome to the O.H.I.O Fund Report. I'm Jeffrey Stern, a principal at the O.H.I.O Fund and host of today's conversation, where I had the real pleasure of speaking with TJ Dembinski, co-founder and CEO of Eagle Electronics, which is dedicated to onshoring and securing America's manufacturing of critical technologies, starting with IoT and automotive-grade cellular modules. This conversation traces a fascinating arc, one that begins with the macro and geopolitical forces shaping global commerce and lands in a Northeast Ohio advanced microelectronic manufacturing floor, where Eagle Electronics is domestically building one of the most critical pieces of our digital infrastructure stack, the cellular module. TJ's story and the founding of Eagle is deeply embedded in these broader structural shifts, from the decoupling of U.S. global supply chains to the growing momentum around domestic manufacturing and reindustrialization to the evolving national security concerns that now govern the production of connected technologies and securing America's supply chains. Before founding Eagle, TJ was a partner at Drive Capital, where he spent over 5 years exploring and investing at the frontiers of emerging technologies, from AI to cybersecurity to advanced manufacturing. In our conversation, we explore how his vantage point as an investor informed his transition to becoming a founder and entrepreneur, and how Eagle Electronics emerged from an intersection of powerful global tailwinds and one very specific customer need. We also talk about the nuances of reshoring, what onshoring looks like in practice, what cellular modules even are, and why Ohio, of all places, is emerging as the epicenter of America's next industrial chapter. From partnerships to cutting-edge automation, from regulatory and security considerations to hard-earned insights about what it actually takes to build something physical at scale, TJ brings an insightful clarity to one of the most exciting, complex, and important entrepreneurial movements underway today, and how Eagle Electronics is positioned to lead within it. So with that, please enjoy this fascinating conversation with TJ Dembinski.
I remember of the first times we met was when I would frame it, you were exploring the idea maze. And it actually wasn't about critical technologies, advanced manufacturing. We were talking about AI and where investing in AI, where enterprise value might accrue, where people were building in AI, and how it just kind of changes the whole landscape of things. And I wanted to kind of start there because I always find it really fascinating how if you look at your decision tree of your life and you know, kind of map your career against it, how it's very difficult with any kind of clairvoyance to say and know, you know, this is the path that I was on. But from a place of retrospect and where we are today, you know, you can kind of look back at your life and career and identify maybe the thread that ties it all together. And as a way of introduction, I wanted to ask, in reflection, what would you say is the thread that ties your career together?
Interesting. I'd probably say the biggest thread, and it's actually more of it's a philosophical answer to some extent, but I often think about whether you direct your life or whether life happens to you. And I think it's a funny thing, but most of us operate in contexts that are so much greater than us, meaning there are macro trends that are just so powerful that they pull you in. And if I think back to my career, I have ridden the tailwinds of a lot of macro trends, not so much because I was smart and I chose to do those things, but because I was exploring opportunities, and there were opportunities that originated as a result of those macro trends that pulled me in. And if I think about this past year and how we originally met, one of the opportunities that I was exploring was around investing in the AI space. It feels like this inevitable tailwind. All of the momentum is in that world, and we read about it every day in the newspapers. And now I think, so that was the trend that I was exploring at the time. But what's the funny thing is, if you think about these macro trends that pull you in, there's another broader macro trend that's pulling us in. And it's probably the onshoring of manufacturing in the US, and frankly, the decoupling of supply chains between the US and China. And that was just another one of those tailwinds that was so powerful. I wish I could say that it was this intentional effort of mine to go build a business in the space. But I think that was the space that pulled me in, and it was this macro trend that I just couldn't shake.
Yeah. Well, and it was powerful enough to kind of inspire the transition from investing to founding of an organization. Just kind of take us through the evolution, if you will, of how you thought about what this trend even was, and where the opportunity within it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to some extent this has been a trend that has been going on for really the last decade as geopolitics have played out, and as this has just become more of a hot button issue. The way this specific opportunity with Eagle came about was, it was actually the result of the last few years of work that I'd done. Back in 2016, so prior to founding Eagle, I had been investor at Drive for the 5.5 years prior to that. One of the businesses that we'd had the good fortune of investing in was a company called Finite State. Finite State had really the thesis for the business was most vulnerabilities that exist in an end hardware product are typically not the result of final assembly. They're the result of there being a vulnerability somewhere along either the hardware or the software supply chain, and that being the ultimate exploit point. Finite State had its big break in 2019 when they were the ones that discovered many of the backdoors that existed in Huawei equipment. And as a result of that, really a number of Chinese businesses had reached out to them and said, hey, we need to find a way to assuage our customers' fears and let them know that, hey, that our product is okay for American consumers, it is okay for American businesses, there are no vulnerabilities, and therefore it is okay for you to design into your end product. One of those companies was a company called Quectel, and it has been and continues to be a good relationship. About 1.5 years ago, though, as geopolitical tensions continued to bubble up, they reached out to Matt, the founder of Finite State, and said, hey, we need to find a way to guarantee continuity of supply to our customers under any geopolitical scenario. Do you have any ideas on where to start? And that was how we got in. That was how myself and my partner Mark got introduced to the team. And what we pretty quickly said to them was, we said, hey, we have no interest in this being a one-off consulting project for how to onshore manufacturing.
Yep.
However, we do believe that all of the macro trends that you're caught in the middle of are not unique to you. Geopolitical tensions are only increasing. The desire to onshore manufacturing domestically is only increasing. And frankly, end customers' desires to procure from American suppliers and sort of onshored suppliers is only increasing. We want to go build the onshoring partner of choice, both for companies like yourself, but also then for those end customers. And we would use the sort of story of onshoring with you guys as the case study on how to do this. So that's kind of the origin story, and we haven't really looked back since.
To set a bit of maybe a historical backdrop to some of those tailwinds that you've been working with in the formation of Eagle, what happened with advanced manufacturing here? Like, what is the story of onshoring and reindustrialization? I kind of love from the perspective of Eagle, a lot of people are talking about what that looks like in practice, and there isn't a lot of what it looks like in practice.
Yeah, that is true. Although I would say if you look at the trend line, you're starting to see a lot of it happen in practice. If you zoom out for a second, 30 years ago, we offshored a huge amount of manufacturing, both advanced manufacturing and then also not advanced manufacturing. That was just the result of a labor arbitrage that existed between Asia and the US. the past really decade, I think you've seen a huge amount of investment in automation. And the irony is that has actually made American manufacturing more competitive. So, and it's funny, I think one of the things that we found is that in Asia, a lot of the reason that folks have made investment into manufacturing technology is not for cost reduction. It's actually for quality control. Basically, there's so much turnover on these lines that they need to have advanced manufacturing and sort of automated manufacturing in order to control the quality, because there isn't a huge amount of like knowledge stability on the line.
But the byproduct is that you can do it more
affordably. And so what's interesting though is that in the U.S., what that has actually allowed for is it's allowed for kind of a cost parity or a relative cost parity, where all of a sudden the cost to produce a product overseas is not so different than the cost to produce a product domestically. Just because now, if you look at kind of the total product cost, the percentage that is the goods has increased, and the percentage that is the result of kind of a value add from the manufacturing side has diminished. And so the irony is that has now made American manufacturing more productive and more possible. And while you're right that in kind of, if you were to look at it from an absolute number of sort of advanced plants that exist here today relative to other parts of the world, we're small. But if you look at the trend line and probably the year-over-year growth rate, we're rapidly increasing. I think you've seen that with TSMC Arizona.
Yep.
You've seen that with all of the incentives that have come from both the federal and state levels. And then you've seen that probably most recently with last week's announcement of Anduril coming to Ohio.
Totally. In reflection on where this kind of tailwind came from, and it's in one of these kind of rare bipartisan supports of it. There's an agreement that it is important for us to reconsider how we have done manufacturing and supply chains. What do you find was the catalyst for this kind of thinking at a higher level? I
think in a lot of ways it's a very easy political story to get behind. Jobs are bipartisan. Advanced technology is bipartisan, and a desire for America to be secure and control its destiny from a critical technologies perspective is a bipartisan belief. And all of these trends have kind of coalesced together such that Republicans, Democrats, everyone in between has been able to say, hey, this is an easy thing for us to support. All of our constituents like it, and therefore I'm going to put my weight behind it.
When you talk about critical technologies, can you expand upon what we're actually talking about?
Yeah. A lot of this is kind of the advanced manufacturing on electronics, starting at really, you can kind of start at the base chip level. I think there's a number of folks that worry about our reliance on Taiwan for a lot of the critical chips that underlie most of our critical technology. And as a result, folks have wanted kind of to diversify diversify away from our reliance on that to having a lot of those capabilities onshored. That's what's led to the TSMC Arizona plant, and frankly, all of the subsequent chip manufacturing efforts that we've seen.
So you mentioned Anduril as a recent move from California to Ohio kind of story, and Palmer Luckey had mentioned this phrase, hinting at why that was the case, and kind of described Ohio as a place that can pull you in and speed you up, which I just appreciate very much as a pithy aphorism for why you might want to do and consider building here. From your perspective, though, as you considered all the possible places that you could have built Eagle, what was it about here that made it interesting and compelling?
So I think there's a couple of things. One, obviously, my co-founder in this is Mark Kwame. He's one of the founders of Drive. He's the founder of the O.H.I.O Fund. I've known him now for the better part of almost 7 years. When we began working on this idea, I think it just so happened that obviously the O.H.I.O Fund had been raised, and that was a wonderful source of opportunity and sort of a way to have this vision be realized. I think, two, one of the things that we did was we called every contract manufacturer that we could find to understand who had the capabilities, the workforce to do this, and the knowledge to run the machinery that we're going to have to run. And frankly, it's pretty remarkable. You start calling around and you realize that there's actually only a handful of places that are able to do that. We came across a contract manufacturer up here in Northeast Ohio called Coax Technology, which is where we were yesterday and where we're setting up the line. And First off, the team there was wonderful. Management was willing to work with us and kind of architect what is a pretty unique relationship for this. And then lastly, there was, just because this is a part of the world and a part of America that builds things. And so there were a huge amount of incentives actually to base manufacturing here. Chiefly, we're actually able to operate in a foreign trade zone, which means that all of the materials that come in are there. We do not pay a tariff upon import, or I guess upon entrance into the foreign trade zone. And then provided we ship out, which a lot of final assembly for technology products still exists over in Asia, there's no tariff upon exit either, which means that actually we're able to do this at a pretty cost competitive price. And then lastly, I think you just see it. I wish I had the stat off the top of my head, but if you look across kind of all 50 states and where the majority of these projects, the major products that you read about in the newspapers have originated, you got to think that there's not a lot of places that is ahead of Ohio. Obviously, the Intel plant is being built down in central Ohio. Anduril's plant is being built down in central Ohio. And I can just think of a number of smaller things that we are all aware of, just given our proximity, you just don't read about many of these big infrastructure projects happening to the extent that they're happening here.
So with that backdrop and context laid out, what is Eagle Electronics?
So if you zoom out for a second, really the thesis here was we want to onshore the manufacturing of critical technology. One of the most critical pieces of this is the cellular module. Kind of any connected device will likely have a cellular module in it. None of that manufacturing happens here domestically. And what we are doing is we're bringing back cellular module manufacturing to the U.S. So the way we have done this is we have licensed technology from Quectel. They're the global leader in cellular module manufacturing. And we plan on producing our own modules domestically here.
Help me understand what a cellular module is. When we think about semiconductor chips, where does this fall in the value chain of microelectronics? Yeah.
So any connected device that connects to one of the carrier networks, so think T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon, that will have that is a cellular module. That is what it allows for the device to connect to the carrier networks and ultimately have connectivity built in. We all use a cellular module on a daily basis. And this is like anything. If you zoom out for a second, you think, okay, are there going to be more connected devices tomorrow than there are today? I bet that the answer is yes. And as a result, we thought this was a really compelling area to go build the business and start, just given the fact that all of this manufacturing for this technology happens overseas. None of it happens domestically. And we're going to be the first to manufacture these here.
How do you do that?
Yeah, so that is what we've gone into. So that is with our arrangement with COEX. And so what we've done, it's actually pretty funny. We were walking the line yesterday at COEX, and what we realized is that there really isn't equipment the equipment that we have purchased just doesn't really exist in the U.S. Yeah. So we purchased the most up-to-date Fuji machinery, and then we've purchased a whole lot of proprietary testing technology. So what we're doing now is we're setting up a line at COEX. That is our contract manufacturer. We've subleased space from them. And this is going to be a line fully devoted to manufacturing the modules. What's interesting is most contract manufacturing on the electronics side that happens in the U.S. today is high mix, low volume. What we are doing is the exact opposite. We are high volume, low mix. And as a result, like the machinery that exists in most of the CMs that we look at today has a very different purpose than the machinery that we have done. So the machinery that we've purchased is devoted to mass production. Like think this is wide commercial application scale. And that is what we are setting up just at COEX today.
Mm. So if you think about Eagle in the context of a way for international companies to retain, access to the North American market, while you mentioned assuaging of the security concerns of those who might buy those products domestically, what is the regulatory environment in which Eagle is operating and kind of the challenges, the tensions that it has to navigate through?
Yeah, I think the answer is it's constantly evolving. I joke that it's way better to be lucky than it is to be smart. So when we started this business, I think we had a feeling and a sense that there were these inevitable macro trends that was going to lead to a decoupling of supply chains. I don't think that we had realized how quickly it was going to happen. So even just since we've started this, the connected vehicle rule has been sort of the primary catalyst for a lot of folks thinking of, okay, how do I start to make procurement decisions that are compliant with now a new and evolving regulatory framework?
What is the connected vehicle rule?
So the connected vehicle rule it now governs how anyone that's making connected cars, which is virtually every car that's on the road, every new car that's on the road, how they have to make their purchasing and procurement decisions. And it has a specific provision against purchasing from what we call foreign adversaries, meaning Chinese or Russian companies. That's a big deal for the supply chain, because a lot of this stuff still is manufactured over in China. A lot of the code that gets written is still written over in China, and a lot of the hardware originates over in China. And so this is a pretty meaningful piece of regulation that every company now that is affected by this has to make changes to their supply chain. What's interesting too is obviously there's a new administration as of this past Monday, and what we have wanted to understand is, okay, is this the starting point or is this the ending point? And I think what we have found is that this is really the starting point, and that what is likely to happen is that all of the requirements of the connected vehicle rule are likely to go and apply now to the rest of industry and govern, frankly, just sort of a new supply chain that is just beginning to be built.
So I think we've all, as a society, been a witness to, maybe at its worst, what happens if you're dependent or reliant on an adversary supplying technology that your, for example, maybe military is dependent on. What might happen, in that scenario? How do you go about assuaging the actual security concerns?
Yeah, well, I think that you have to bifurcate what is real risk versus what is perceived risk. And what that requires is actually a pretty strong understanding of where the exploit points might come from and where the vulnerabilities might lie. And that is a big thing that we have had to go and do when we talk to customers, because obviously folks are going to say, hey, a lot of the technology that you are building today is based off of a Quectel design. And that's where I say, actually, no, a lot of the technology that we're going and building today is really based off of a Qualcomm reference design, which is a Qualcomm's obviously based out of San Diego, an American business. So that is kind of one of those things where, is that a perceived risk or is that a real risk? And a lot of the ways, I think a lot of the hardware piece, it's a perceived risk. Then there's the question of, okay, well, software interacts with this. And that's where you have to go and say, well, actually, no, we have a secure North American build environment. We have an American-based software team. And we're working with finite state, which is how this whole opportunity originated, to go and say, well, no, we're doing a full security test, audit, and analysis of the source code and all of the code that goes onto these modules prior to them going out into the wild and then being what we as Americans consume.
So I think you and I both have spent a lot of time with founders and thinking about startups and the life cycle trajectory of them. And Eagle, in the context of that startup life cycle, I think is somewhat unique in the trajectory that it has and what those stages might look like. The idea of an MVP. How have you thought about what the chapters of the Eagle life cycle are? Knowing there's this arrangement with Quectel to kind of get started, but a broader vision to do this more holistically for a broad set of critical technologies.
Yeah, it's funny. So, I joke. I spent the last 5.5 years as a venture investor prior to starting Eagle. And one of the things we always say is, when you're starting a business, you need to push into the market in order to ultimately create pull. From really day one, we've had pull into this market. And I think that just speaks to the fact that there are broader macro tailwinds for what we're doing. The interesting thing too is that most businesses that are affected by these macro tailwinds, they're not small businesses. They're global enterprises that navigate sort of they navigate a Chinese regulatory environment, they navigate an American regulatory environment, they navigate a European regulatory environment, they navigate just an entire, a global regulatory environment. And what that's meant is they need to find ways to have single product designs, but for a global customer set. And that's actually really hard when there's evolving regulatory environments. And so one of the things that we want to do with Eagle is say, hey, no, you can still have a single global product a single product design, but do so in a regulatory compliant way globally. We're starting with the cellular module because it's really unique where if you think about kind of where we're going to have the most competitive manufacturing, it is likely in these highly automated spaces, just because the labor arbitrage still does exist. Mm-hmm. And so the more you can automate as the manufacturing, the more competitive it's going to be domestically. And this is fortunately a very automated manufacturing thing. Now there's still a number of folks that are on the line, but just relative to kind of final assembly where there's plastics and injection molding, that is not what this is. Over time, we want to go use kind of this case study on saying, okay, we identified a really critical piece of technology that is not manufactured here, and we found a way to onshore the manufacturing. Now we want to go and do this across subsequent verticals. And so we started really at the module itself. I think the next thing that we want to go do is do the full board. And then after doing the full PCBA board, we want to go do then kind of final assembly.
Mm. This is comprising the real whole value chain.
I think exactly. Growing the sort of opportunity that is in front of us and the amount that we can offer our customers over a time is priority number one. Now there's a crawl and then there's a walk and then there's a run. Yeah. We are still in the spectrum of that, very much in the crawl phase.
You mentioned, the people working on the line, who knowing that in the context of when you were exploring, coax and its, peers who might have even the capability of doing this kind of work, do we have the workforce and people who have the acumen and the know-how to work on these lines if we haven't had a lot of them historically?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's actually one of the things that attracted us, one, to O.H.I.O, and then two, to coax specifically. If you just zoom out for a second, I think the reason that we have found a number of these huge infrastructure projects coming to O.H.I.O is because O.H.I.O has been very intentional about how it's created a labor workforce that can handle this type of manufacturing. Ohio State has put a lot into training folks to do this type of work, which is why Intel and Anduril ended up there. Up in Northeast Ohio, you've got Lorain Technical Community College that has also similarly got a big MEMS program. And as a result, I think there's kind of these more these programs that will allow for this workforce with this sort of very specialized skill set to continue to exist and continue to pump out more folks every year that are able to do this. At coax in particular, it's still a pretty specialized skill set, and there's a lot of engineering know-how. SMT, which is the technology that we will use to manufacture these modules, is all surface mount technology manufacturing equipment. That is a specialized type of manufacturing equipment, and to find the folks that have experience on that is not common. Mm. And so by partnering with coax on day one, we're able to have a workforce that knows how to do this.
Knowing what you had described as the pull into the market and how large of an opportunity this is, all of the geopolitical tailwinds, kind of the macro structural trends that have created the space for this opportunity. Why haven't there been more, goes at bat from, other companies? When you think about competition, how do you think about competition?
It's a good question. One of the questions that we would always ask in venture investing was, why now?
Yeah.
And I think the reality is it's only been I have found that every day there has been more momentum for what we're doing and for onshored manufacturing than there was the previous day. And I think that's the result of now there just is starting to be a much broader focus on this from a policy perspective. And so you saw the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a lot of money set aside to go and incentivize this type of project. That is ultimately what led to the Intel plant. And then in addition, there's now more regulatory regulatory motivation as well. And so I think that like there has always been a desire to do this, but there haven't really been the pieces that have been put in place that have allowed for it to happen from a practical perspective. And I think one other thing that I would add is there's this chart in our fundraising deck that we love to show. And if you look at a plant that exists over in China or other parts of Asia, kind of more broadly, about a decade ago, if it cost $1 to produce a product, it now costs 30 cents as a result of all the automation that has occurred. And we're able to take that manufacturing advancement and bring it here, where all of a sudden you've actually got cost competitive manufacturing as well.
So you've mentioned a few times now how your experience as an investor has maybe influenced, your approach and thinking as a founder. As it should. It's the experience that you've had. What have more personally, just what have you learned now as a founder that maybe you wish you had known as an investor, and what have been the most useful, observations or learnings that you've earned as an investor through working with so many different founders that you've been able to apply as a founder?
One, I think the biggest thing is like you can always overthink everything and deliberate forever. Sometimes you just got to make a decision, stick to it, and then reevaluate after you know what the outcome is going to be. I think the second thing is, man, I'm embarrassed now about how much time I took up from founders when I was an investor, where at the end of the day, like no one is going to solve that problem unless you as the founder do it. And every time you spend talking to folks that are not going to help you solve whatever the problem is of the day, then you're just that amount of time further away from finding the actual solution. And then lastly, there's like a real psychological thing of being a founder where you feel a huge amount of ownership and responsibility for it. And at the end of the day, like investors, they take on real risk as well, but no one is more tied to the outcome than you as the founder.
So I want to spend a little time talking about funding.
Yeah.
I think you and your co-founder, Mark, have probably spent more time than just about anyone thinking, both as a investor here in Ohio and also as a founder here in Ohio, what the landscape looks like and the perspective from both sides of it. What is your perspective on capital in Ohio and the role that it should play, particularly in the context of this vast opportunity for reshoring and reindustrialization?
For any venture, capital is critical, and I think Drive Capital really changed the landscape when it started in 2012. Where if you just at the end of the day, like funding, opportunity, all of those things, they are easier to come by when proximity is there. And Drive Capital was the first fund that really brought kind of that Silicon Valley mindset of investing to places outside of Silicon Valley. And that changed, I think, the opportunity here and the way that people were thinking about building companies in Ohio, and frankly, in the broader region. And as a result, you've really seen this I would say, momentum build from that. Yeah. Where it's like the snowball effect, where once things get rolling, they continued to go in that direction. And now it's not atypical to see a Silicon Valley venture firm come and invest in an Ohio-based business, or a New York or Boston-based venture firm come and invest in an Ohio-based business. That is really at the growth stage, though. It is still absolutely true that at the earliest stages, capital and sort of rounds that come together are the result of proximity. Where I was reading this thing last night, where when you least need money is when you're most likely to get funding, and that is just. And it's oftentimes when businesses like most need money that they're the least likely to get funding. And as a result, I think like you're more likely to just serendipitously have a funding opportunity occur when there's more capital located in the areas that you're building the business in. And so I think it's absolutely true now that like funding has allowed for businesses to be built here. And then if you add that on to kind of the broader trend of onshoring and really manufacturing, I think one of the theses that Drive had and that I still believe is that founder market fit is incredibly important. And a lot of the opportunities and problems that need to be solved, like there aren't people investing in those. And that is because there isn't really the founder mentality. Like most businesses that are being built in Silicon Valley today, they're all AI and software oriented. Yep. A lot of the businesses that are built here are like moving atoms, and that is just because that is what people know here. That is like what the legacy industrial base has been built around. And so you see a lot of those opportunities in the companies that go and solve those problems be built in this part of the world. And so it's absolutely critical that there's also capital here to back those founders up.
Yeah, we do have this rich industrious history of building things and knowing how to build things. In the spirit of, your and Eagle's grander ambition to reshore critical technology manufacturing, what do you think is required of the whole ecosystem to realize that vision? And what is Eagle's role to play in it? Like, how do you think about what success looks like?
It's a great question. Firstly, I think capital is critical. It is not for the faint of heart, and it is not for the faint of heart from a funder's perspective either. Just the equipment, the manufacturing equipment that we have invested in on day one to go and start this business is almost $4.5 million worth of equipment. Like, you need the ability to access real capital and sort of have investors that are willing to stomach the risk that comes with that in order to get this business off the ground. From there, I think you need to continue to see like an ecosystem be built up around this. I think we were very fortunate to find coax. I think that the reality is that you need a lot more coaxes to exist in this part of the world if we're going to see what we're doing to be just a drop in the ocean in terms of a much bigger trend. And then lastly, I think you just need to see, like, my goal here is that we're not the only person doing this. My goal is that we have a lot of copycats down the line. And that would be wonderful, because the reality is that I'm a believer that a rising tide floats all boats. And if we have more folks to trade with and to partner with on kind of subsequent projects and subsequent ambitions, then I think we're more likely to see success.
What are you most excited and optimistic about?
So all of this has been in the hypothetical so far. We were walking the line yesterday and all of the equipment has now shown up. We got to kick off manufacturing, and we expect that we're going to kick off manufacturing in Q3 of this year. Hopefully sooner, but this is very different than the world of software where you kind of ship it and if it breaks, you fix it. In our case, like, is $4.5 million equipment. We got to set it up right on day one, and then we got to go and properly manufacture from there. And I am most excited to see modules coming off the line and ultimately shipping to our customers.
Yeah, you mentioned operating in the world of atoms. What do you think have been the lessons that you've picked up on building in hardware and with software, but really kind of grounded in the world of atoms?
I think there's a lot less margin for error. So in software, like, we used to say, just like, keep pivoting.
Yeah.
You can't really do that in this. And it's funny, like, the pivots that we have had since we've started, they're absolutely pivots. Like, the vision and the model of what we are doing, and it's kind of where I understand even our value prop for a lot of customers has changed since day one of founding the business. But at the crux of it, like, we are still manufacturing cellular modules. That is, and what that means is, like, we have to set this line up on properly. And this is $4.5 million equipment. Like, you can't go set up a subsequent line if you get the first line wrong. You won't have the capital. You won't have the know-how. You won't really, like, there's just no reason to say that you have the right to do that.
Yeah.
As I think about this, like, there's just a lot less margin for error. Now, all that said, I think the second thing is too, on just the economic side of it, like, software, there's zero marginal cost to selling. And what we're doing, like, that is not true. There are materials that go into this that cost real dollars. And so from a unit economics perspective, we have to be really confident that what we are doing is correct.
Yep.
Otherwise, it's really easy to sell a buck for 90 cents. And that is the last thing that we want to do.
Well, in the spirit of pivots, I think one of the patterns that I've picked up on is just that it's very rare that the business that a company was founded on is the business that the company succeeds with. And you've mentioned now, the evolution of Eagle. How would you describe what the value proposition is?
Yeah, it's funny. My answer to this has changed over time. And that is without the actual fundamental business model changing too much. I thought for a brief period, I thought when we initially founded that this was going to be part of like a people just want to buy from American suppliers. They want to buy American manufactured devices. And they also would be looking for ways to protect against the potential or the possibility of tariffs. I think all of those things are still true, and that those are very real motivations for customers purchasing. What I've realized the primary motivation is, though, for customers purchasing is trust and security. They want American software on their devices, and they want an American development team being the ones that are going and testing the software and then ultimately uploading it to the modules. And that has changed the way I've thought about this business and how it's scaling over time when you really realize that you're in the trust and the security business.
What do you feel is unsaid? Obviously, we've covered a lot of ground here, but in reflecting on your journey personally on the business of Eagle, is there a particularly important or salient aspect that you think is interesting to talk about?
Yeah, I think it's a funny thing. I think that what gets lost in all of the political rhetoric these days is nuance. And that's a dirty word when it comes to talking about big, complicated macro ideas. But nuance is inherent in anything that is big and macro and complicated. And one of the things that I have found that where we have lacked nuance is, like, in a lot of ways, we need to find partners that are going to be good, positive collaborators with us that are not American. And in our case, like, a lot of the partners that we've found have been Chinese companies or folks that are part of a Chinese company. And you just can't have a supply chain where you say, hey, today you can only buy American, because we are so intertwined as two nations. And as a result, like, it's not as easy as an executive order saying tomorrow we can't buy Chinese components, we can't buy anything from China. And so as a result, like, I think that when we think about our supply chain, we really need to recognize that, like, we as two countries are very intertwined and have policy that recognizes that.
How do you foster a consideration or awareness or tolerance of nuance?
I think knowledge is critical, and having people become aware of that is critical. Like, most people recognize that they look at the inside of their shirts or wherever it is, and it says made in X, and that is typically not America. And that is true for every part of sort of the manufacturing value chain, or that is true for most things that we manufacture. And I think that once people can actually recognize that, while also saying that, like, all of the motivations and aspirations of onshoring manufacturing are noble and things that we should be doing, but recognize that what comes with that is a necessity to collaborate, because in a lot of ways we don't have everything that is required to do that here on day one. That's why you're seeing the TSMC Arizona plant get built. Like, we had to do that in conjunction with TSMC, because they're the only folks in the world that have the knowledge that's required to do that.
What other earned wisdom do you feel you've picked up in this business so far?
I don't know if I have much wisdom yet. No, I think that my biggest piece of advice to myself throughout this has been, like, to just keep going and to turn the next page and see what you're going to uncover. I mean, it's funny, like, when this whole thing got going, I put this at about a 1% probability of actually occurring. In every subsequent meeting, I'd say, you know what, maybe we went from 1% to 3% today, and then from 3% to 4% the next day, and it kind of slowly inched up into being more and more possible. And now I'm pretty darn confident that we're going to have modules that come off of these lines that ultimately American businesses purchase and sell to an American consumer. And that's, like, a really exciting thing to think about. But along the way, there have been all sorts of ups and downs. There have been days where I thought, we're going to take over the world and be a public business. And then there's days where I thought we were going to go out of business the following day. And I just need to keep reminding myself to take the deep breaths, appreciate this along the way, and know that as you continue to turn the next page, like, there's going to be opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, that is the entrepreneurial roller coaster. It's
totally.
Demoralizingly low lows and kind of euphoric highs along the way.
Yeah.
Well, we'll round it out in some closing questions to bookend the conversation. Our traditional closing question is for a hidden gem in Cleveland.
Interesting. I doubt it's hidden, but Mark and I had dinner on Wednesday night at the Marble Room which is this like beautiful steakhouse in downtown Cleveland. And I love things that I think are world class, and you could put them anywhere in the world and it'd be the best at what they do. And the atmosphere, the interior of that place is world class.
Yeah.
And you could put that thing in anywhere in the world and people would say, man, I want to go get a steak there.
Yeah, it is an inspired ambiance and atmosphere. Any parting words?
No, thanks for having me on the podcast. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. If people had anything they wanted to follow up with you about, learn more about Eagle, where would you direct them?
Reach out directly. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I'd love to meet more folks.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Ohio Fund Report. If you enjoyed this podcast, we'd love for you to leave a review on your favorite platform and subscribe to stay updated on all future episodes. You can subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or directly on our website at theohiofund.com. The information shared on this podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, an offer to sell, or a solicitation of an offer to buy any security. Past performance is not indicative of future results. The views and opinions expressed by our guests are solely their own and do not necessarily represent those of the Ohio Fund. A guest's participation in this podcast does not imply an endorsement or an investment recommendation by the Ohio Fund. This podcast may include conversations with leadership of a company in which the Ohio Fund or its affiliated funds have an investment, and as such, financial interest in the success of this company, and there may be a conflict of interest in presenting information about the company and its performance. Any forward-looking statements or projections discussed during this episode are based on current expectations, assumptions, and estimates. Actual outcomes may differ materially due to a variety of risks, uncertainties, and other factors. Listeners should consult their own legal, tax, and financial advisors before making any investment decisions. For more information about the O.H.I.O Fund, including our Form ADV, other regulatory filings, and additional conversations, please visit theohiofund.com.